No, it can't be. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not him. No!
The champagne glass trembled in Anika Shaw's hand as she watched the man on stage command the room with effortless authority. Her ex-husband. The same man whose worn Toyota Corolla had embarrassed her in front of her friends. The same man whose quiet presence had felt like a prison. Graham Mercer stood at the podium of the Mercer Trust Winter Soiree, his voice steady and warm as he addressed a room full of Arizona's wealthiest donors and most influential executives. "We live in a world that confuses price with value," he said, and the words hit Anika like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not him. Before we go back to where it all started, if you love stories about second chances, reality checks, and the price people pay for chasing the wrong things, hit subscribe now, because what happens next to Anika will stay with you. And drop a comment. What would you have done in Anika's shoes? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away? 4 years earlier, Anika had been a different person with the same dreams. She grew up in Coyote Ridge, a working-class suburb where ambition felt like a secret language only she spoke. Her father, Suresh, worked for the city's public works department, a steady job that meant steady paychecks and absolutely nothing more. She loved him fiercely, but watching him clip coupons on Sunday mornings and calculate gas prices down to the penny filled her with a quiet terror. This would not be her life. She refused to disappear into modest contentment the way he had. At night, Anika scrolled through Instagram feeds of girls from high school who'd married doctors and tech executives. Her college friend Marisol posted photos from rooftop bars in Crescent City, designer bags casually placed in the corner of each shot like punctuation marks on a life well lived. Anika wanted that world the way some people wanted air. She wasn't shallow, she told herself. She was strategic. She understood that in America, money wasn't just comfort. It was respect. It was visibility. It was proof you mattered. When Suresh first mentioned Graham Mercer, Anika felt her stomach drop before she'd even met him. A nice young man, her father said, which in immigrant parent code meant stable and boring. Works in property management. Very respectful family. The introduction happened at a community dinner, one of those gatherings where aunties evaluated potential matches over samosas and chai. Graham arrived in khakis and a button-down shirt that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. He was polite, almost painfully so, with the kind of quiet presence that made him easy to overlook in a crowded room. Their first conversation lasted maybe 20 minutes. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to her answers, which should have been refreshing, but somehow felt like another mark against him. Guys with real ambition didn't have time to be this attentive. They were busy building empires. Graham told her he worked in property management, and when she pressed for details, he deflected smoothly to ask about her work at the nonprofit arts organization. Red flag, she thought. Men who were going places loved talking about themselves. The marriage proposal came 6 weeks later, facilitated by their families in that old-fashioned way that made Anika feel like she was playing a role in someone else's story. Graham presented her with a simple ring, nothing flashy, and asked if she'd build a life with him. Not build an empire, not chase dreams together, just build a life. She said yes because saying no felt impossible under the weight of her father's hopeful eyes and her mother's excited planning. She said yes and told herself she could make this work. People grew into love, didn't they? Maybe Graham had hidden depths. Maybe the quiet exterior concealed the kind of ambition that didn't need to announce itself. The wedding was simple, held at a community center with too many folding chairs and homemade decorations that Anika's mother insisted looked elegant. Graham seemed genuinely happy, which almost made it worse. He looked at her like she was a miracle, and all she could think about was Marisol's wedding 2 months earlier at a vineyard with a live band and flowers that cost more than Anika's entire ceremony. Their apartment was small, a 2-bedroom in a complex that had seen better decades. Graham's furniture was functional and mismatched. He owned exactly 3 dress shirts. His car was that godforsaken Toyota Corolla with paint that didn't quite match on the passenger door from some previous repair. When Anika asked why he didn't lease something nicer, he'd smiled that maddeningly calm smile and said a car was just transportation. She'd wanted to scream. The first year of marriage passed in a blur of small disappointments. Graham was attentive in ways that didn't matter. He fixed the leaky faucet himself instead of calling a plumber. He cooked dinner twice a week, simple meals that he seemed proud of. He remembered details about her day and asked follow-up questions that proved he'd been listening. But there were no surprise weekend getaways, no jewelry boxes presented over candlelit dinners, no talk of investment properties or career advancement. He went to work, came home, and seemed genuinely content with a life that felt to Anika like slowly suffocating. Money was always tight. Not desperate, not poverty, but that grinding middle-class tightness, where every unexpected expense required a conversation. When the car needed new tires, they had to delay replacing their dying couch. When Anika wanted to take a pottery class, Graham suggested she wait until next quarter. He never said no outright, which somehow made it worse. He'd just look at their shared spreadsheet with that reasonable expression and ask if maybe they could prioritize differently. Anika started to watch him with something approaching contempt. The way he seemed satisfied with so little. The way he never complained about his job or talked about climbing any ladder. Property management, she discovered, meant he oversaw a handful of small commercial buildings, nothing glamorous. He wore the same rotation of clothes. He packed his lunch. He was, in every visible way, aggressively ordinary. The real breaking point started with a coffee date. Marisol called her up one Tuesday and suggested they meet at one of those expensive cafes in Crescent City where a latte cost $8 and came with foam art. Anika almost said no, calculating the cost against their grocery budget, then felt a flash of anger so intense it surprised her. She was 28 years old. She should be able to buy a damn coffee without mental math. Marisol arrived 15 minutes late in a car Anika didn't recognize, something sleek and German. She looked incredible. Her hair professionally highlighted, her outfit casual in that expensive way that required labels Anika could spot from across the room. They hugged, and Marisol immediately launched into stories about her boyfriend's tech startup and their weekend in Scottsdale. Anika smiled and nodded and felt herself shrinking with every word. "So how's married life?" Marisol asked, and the question felt loaded with pity. "What does Graham do again? Property something?" "Property management," Anika said, hating how defensive she sounded. "He oversees commercial buildings." "Oh, that's great! Super stable," Marisol said, with the kind of enthusiasm people use when they can't think of an actual compliment. "I mean, not everyone needs to be an entrepreneur, right? Someone has to do the regular jobs." Regular jobs. The words echoed in Anika's head for days. She started seeing her life through Marisol's eyes. The apartment that wasn't quite shabby but would never appear on any home design blog. The furniture that worked fine but told no story except we bought the cheapest option. Graham himself, perfectly nice and completely forgettable. When had she become someone who needed defending? When had her life become something to make excuses for? She picked fights, small ones at first, about things that didn't matter. Why didn't he want to go out more? Why was he satisfied with such a limited life? Graham would listen with that infuriating patience and ask what she really wanted. That question enraged her because she couldn't answer it honestly. What she wanted was for him to be different, richer, more ambitious, more impressive when she described him to friends. The networking mixer changed everything. Anika's nonprofit was co-hosting an alumni event with the local university, one of those evening affairs with win and name tags where everyone pretended connection mattered more than opportunity. She almost didn't go, tired after a long week, but something pushed her out the door. Maybe desperation, maybe hope that the world might offer her an exit ramp from the life she'd chosen. Dylan Cross introduced himself near the appetizer table. He was exactly the kind of man Anika had imagined ending up with before reality intervened. Confident without being loud about it. Well-dressed in a way that suggested he didn't think much about clothes because he could afford not to. Connected to everyone in the room. He worked in commercial real estate development, the kind that reshaped city skylines. When he asked what she did, he actually seemed interested in her answer. When she mentioned her husband worked in property management, Dylan didn't give her that pitying look. Instead, he asked intelligent questions about the commercial market, treating Graham like a peer in an industry Dylan dominated. That should have been a green flag. Instead, it felt like proof that Graham was wasting potential Dylan could see even from a distance. They talked for 40 minutes. Dylan made her laugh. He asked for her number to continue a conversation about a potential partnership between his foundation and her nonprofit. It was professional. It was appropriate. It was the most alive Anika had felt in months. The texts started innocently enough. Updates about the potential partnership, questions about her organization's reach, suggestions for coffee to discuss details. Then the messages got longer, more personal. Dylan sent her articles he thought she'd find interesting. He asked about her weekend and actually engaged with her answers. When she mentioned feeling stuck, he didn't offer platitudes. He said, "You're too dynamic for a static life," and something in Anika's chest cracked open. Graham noticed the distance. Of course he did. He was maddeningly observant about everything except his own mediocrity. He asked if she was okay, if they were okay, if there was something he could do. The kindness in his voice made her want to break things. She wanted him to fight, to yell, to show some passion, even if it was anger. Instead, he just watched her with those steady eyes and waited for her to let him in. The explosion came on a Wednesday night. The car needed a repair that would cost $800. Graham sat at their kitchen table with the estimate and that fucking spreadsheet and started talking about adjusting their budget. Maybe they could reduce their entertainment spending. Maybe Anika could hold off on the professional development course she'd wanted to take. All said reasonably, like poverty cosplay was just smart financial planning. Or maybe you could get a better job, Anika snapped. The words hung in the air like smoke. Maybe you could want more than this. More than managing other people's buildings and driving a car that's older than some of my cousins. Graham's face did something she'd never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something sadder and more final. What do you want, Anika? I want a partner who has ambition, who wants to build something, who doesn't think being comfortable is the same as being successful. And you think I don't want those things? I think you're satisfied with mediocrity. I think you've given up and you want me to give up too. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Dylan asking if she was free for dinner on Friday, a new restaurant everyone was talking about. Graham's eyes flicked to the phone, then back to her face. He didn't ask. He didn't accuse. He just stood up from the table and walked to their bedroom. Anika went to dinner with Dylan, then another dinner, then a weekend afternoon at a gallery opening where people drank wine that cost more per bottle than her weekly grocery budget.
Dylan introduced her as his friend, but the way he touched her lower back and leaned in to hear her speak suggested a different story. He showed her what life could look like with resources and connections, Restaurants where they didn't list prices on the menu, events where everyone seemed to know everyone and opportunity moved through the room like electricity. "You deserve this," Dylan said one night, and Anika wanted to believe him so badly it physically hurt. The divorce papers arrived at her decision like she'd been waiting for permission. She found them online, filled them out in a coffee shop so Graham wouldn't see her researching, and presented them on a Sunday morning when the apartment was quiet and there was nowhere to hide. Graham read them slowly. He didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't ask if there was someone else, even though the question lived in the space between them. "Is this really what you want?" he asked finally. Anika thought about Dylan's penthouse view, the way people's faces changed when he entered a room, the future she could see clearly for the first time in years. Yes. Graham signed the papers that afternoon. His hand shook slightly, the only betrayal of emotion in his carefully controlled response. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, and it didn't sound bitter. It sounded like he meant it. That made it worse somehow. Anika moved out within 2 weeks. Dylan helped her find a place, a much nicer apartment in Crescent City that she couldn't quite afford on her nonprofit salary. He offered to help with rent, and she accepted, telling herself it was temporary, telling herself she'd earned this kind of support. The divorce was finalized quickly. Graham didn't contest anything, didn't fight for the furniture or the dishes or any of the small accumulated pieces of their life together. He just let her go. The headline appeared 3 days after the divorce was final. Anika was scrolling through news on her lunch break when she saw his face, Graham's face, on the business section homepage. Graham Mercer named CEO of Mercer Capital and Realty, set to lead multi-billion-dollar firm. She read the article 3 times, certain there was a mistake. But no, there was his photo, professional and polished in a way she'd never seen him. The article detailed how he was the grandson of the late Thomas Mercer, founder of one of Arizona's largest commercial real estate and investment firms. How the will had required Graham to live anonymously for exactly 4 years, on a modest, predetermined budget, before he could inherit his position. How the board had just voted unanimously to confirm him as CEO, now that the waiting period was complete. 4 years? Anika did the math with shaking hands. They'd been married for 4 years and 11 months. She'd left him 3 weeks before the deadline. 3 weeks before he would have been able to tell her everything. 3 weeks before their entire life would have transformed. The phone slipped from her hand. Around her, coworkers moved through their day, oblivious to the implosion happening at her desk. She'd left him. She'd judged him. She'd called him mediocre and unambitious and satisfied with nothing. And he'd been serving out a sentence this entire time. A test. One he'd apparently passed while she'd failed one she didn't even know she was taking. "You okay?" her colleague asked, and Anika realized she was crying at her desk. Dylan took the news with surprising calm when she told him that evening. They were at his place, the penthouse with the view that had once seemed like everything she wanted. "So, your ex is rich now," he said, pouring himself whiskey. "That doesn't change us." But it did change things. Or maybe it just revealed what had always been true. Dylan was attentive when it suited him, generous when it reflected well on him. He liked having Anika on his arm at events, liked the way she looked in the dresses he bought her, liked the story of rescuing her from a modest life. But increasingly, she felt like an acquisition, a beautiful object he'd won and now displayed. He corrected her at dinner parties, talked over her when she tried to contribute to conversations about business or investment, introduced her to colleagues as "my Anika," in a way that sounded more like ownership than affection. When she pushed back, he'd smile and say he was just trying to help her navigate these circles, that she'd understand the dynamics better with time. The kindness in his voice made the condescension worse. The text from Marisol arrived 2 months after the divorce. An invitation to the Mercer Trust Winter Soiree, a major charity event that Dylan had gotten them tickets to. Graham's company is the main sponsor, Marisol wrote with a string of shocked emojis. Did you know he was that Mercer? Girl, you have to tell me everything. Anika stared at the message until the words blurred. She should decline, should stay home and avoid the humiliation of seeing Graham in his true context while she stood as Dylan's accessory. But something masochistic in her needed to see it, needed to understand exactly what she'd walked away from. The soiree was held at the Crescent City Museum, the kind of venue that required black tie and donations that started at 5 figures. Anika wore a dress Dylan had picked out, something sleek and expensive that didn't quite feel like hers. The room was full of Arizona's elite, everyone dressed in their finest, networking and air-kissing and performing wealth with practiced ease. Graham was holding court near the main gallery when Anika arrived. Not performing or trying too hard, just standing in conversation with a small group who seemed genuinely engaged with whatever he was saying. He looked different. Not just the tailored tuxedo or the confident posture. Something fundamental had shifted in the way he occupied space. This was who he'd been all along, she realized. He'd just been wearing a costume in their marriage, playing a role while she judged him for the part he'd been required to play. Their eyes met across the room. Graham's expression didn't change. No anger, no pain, no acknowledgement of the history between them. He looked at her the way he might look at any guest at any event. Polite, distant, finished. Then he turned back to his conversation, and Anika felt herself disappear. Dylan pulled her toward the bar, oblivious to her distress or indifferent to it. He was already networking, shaking hands with people he knew and angling for introductions to people he didn't. Anika accepted champagne from a passing waiter and tried to keep her hand steady. The speeches started at 8. Various board members and philanthropic directors took turns at the podium, praising the Mercer Trust's work and impact. Then Graham was introduced, and the room erupted in applause that felt genuine rather than obligatory. He stepped to the microphone with an ease that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. "Good evening," he started, his voice carrying perfectly through the space. "I want to talk tonight about value. We live in a world that confuses price with value. That mistakes shine for substance. That measures worth in ways that have nothing to do with actual worth." Anika's champagne glass trembled. Every word felt aimed directly at her, even though Graham never once looked her direction. "My grandfather understood something that took me years to appreciate. He knew that character isn't built in comfort, that integrity can't be purchased, that the measure of a person has nothing to do with what they own and everything to do with what they do when no one's watching, when there's no audience to perform for, when the only thing at stake is who you choose to be when being good costs you something." The room was silent except for his voice. Anika wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Dylan was watching Graham with an expression she couldn't quite read. Calculation, maybe, or recognition of a player better at the game than he was. The trust exists to support people and organizations doing invisible work, the kind that doesn't generate headlines or photo opportunities, the kind that matters anyway, maybe especially because it doesn't come with applause. Graham smiled slightly. My grandfather would have appreciated that irony, given that I'm saying this to a room full of people in very expensive clothes. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Graham continued for another 5 minutes, outlining the trust's priorities and thanking major donors. Then, he stepped down to enthusiastic applause, and Anika realized she'd stopped breathing. "He's good," Dylan murmured. "Very good. That whole humble routine plays perfectly with this crowd." Routine. The word made Anika want to scream. Nothing about Graham had been routine. She'd just been too blinded by her own expectations to see what was actually in front of her. The evening dragged on in a haze of small talk and forced smiles. Anika saw Graham periodically, always surrounded by people who seemed to genuinely enjoy his company. Once she saw him throw his head back, laughing at something an elderly woman said. The gesture so unguarded and real that it hurt to witness. She'd never made him laugh like that. She'd never tried. Dylan suggested they leave around 10. Anika agreed quickly, desperate to escape. But as they moved toward the exit, she saw Graham step away from his group and head toward a hallway marked for museum staff. Something in her chest twisted. Before she could talk herself out of it, she followed him. He was alone in the corridor, checking his phone near a window overlooking the city. He looked up when he heard her heels on the marble floor. His face remained perfectly neutral. "Anika, you let me believe you were nothing." The words came out sharp and accusing. "You let me think you were just some ordinary guy with no ambition." Graham slipped his phone into his pocket and regarded her with something that might have been pity. "I didn't let you believe anything. You assumed there's a difference. You lied to me." "I never lied. I told you I worked in property management, which was true. I told you money was tight, which it was under the terms of the will. I told you exactly who I was. You just decided that wasn't enough. You could have explained about your grandfather, about the inheritance, about what you were waiting for." "No, I couldn't. The will specifically forbade me from telling anyone, including a spouse, until the 4 years were complete. If I'd told you, I would have forfeited everything." Anika felt tears building behind her eyes. "So what? You just let me leave? You didn't fight for us at all?" Graham's face shifted then, a crack in the controlled facade. "Fight for us? Anika, you looked at me with contempt every single day of the last year we were married. You made it clear that who I was wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. What exactly was I supposed to fight for? Your obligation? Your resignation?" He shook his head. "You didn't want me. You wanted what you thought I should be." "That's not fair, isn't it? You filed for divorce because you found someone with more money, someone who could give you the life you thought you deserved. I loved you enough to let you go find it." The tears spilled over. "Did you love me? Really? Or was I just part of the test?" Graham's expression softened slightly. "I loved you completely. That's why it hurt so much to realize you didn't love me back. Not really, you loved an idea of what a husband should provide. I was just disappointing proof that you'd settled." Anika felt the truth of it like a blade between her ribs. "I didn't know. You didn't want to know. There's a difference there, too." He glanced at his watch. "I need to get back. I hope you find what you're looking for." "Graham, wait." She grabbed his arm, desperate. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then back at her face. "I know you are, but sorry doesn't actually change anything, does it? You made your choice. I made mine by respecting it." He gently removed her hand and walked back toward the gala. Anika stood alone in the hallway, her carefully applied makeup running down her face, and understood with perfect clarity that she'd destroyed the best thing in her life because it hadn't looked the way she'd expected it to look. Dylan was waiting by the coat check, irritated by her disappearance. "Where were you? I needed air." "Well, you missed a great connection. The president of Southwestern Development Group. We're having lunch next week." He helped her into her coat, already moving on to the next opportunity. "Did you see the way Mercer worked that room? That's instinct. You can't teach that." Something in Anika snapped. "You don't know anything about him." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "I know he's positioned perfectly for the next phase of urban development. I know his family has connections going back 40 years. I know he's worth paying attention to." He smiled. "Don't worry. I'm not suggesting we socialize. I know that would be awkward for you. But business is business." They drove home in silence. Dylan didn't notice her distress, or chose not to acknowledge it. At the penthouse, he poured himself a drink and started scrolling through his phone. "I'm thinking we should host something next month. Small dinner party, very exclusive, good for both our networks." Anika looked around the space that had once seemed like everything she wanted. The expensive furniture and curated art and view that cost more than most people's annual salary. It felt hollow, beautiful and empty and hollow. "I need to tell you something," she said suddenly. "About Graham, about why we really divorced." Dylan looked up from his phone. "Does it matter? It's done." "It matters to me." He sighed the way someone might sigh at a child's insistence. "Okay, tell me." Anika explained about the will, about the 4-year requirement, about the timing of their divorce. Dylan listened with increasing interest, though not the kind Anika expected. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. So, he was rich the whole time. He was serving out a requirement. And now he's positioned to make major moves in commercial development, moves that might overlap with my projects. Dylan's mind was clearly working through angles and opportunities. This is actually useful information. That's not why I told you. Still useful. He smiled at her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know what else is useful? You were married to him. You probably know things about how he thinks, how he operates. That's valuable intelligence." Anika felt cold spread through her chest. "I'm not going to spy on my ex-husband. I'm not asking you to spy. I'm just saying you have insights. And insights can be valuable in negotiations." Dylan crossed to where she stood and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Look, I get that you're feeling guilty about the divorce, but you didn't do anything wrong. You made a choice based on the information you had. He chose not to give you complete information. If anything, he's the one who failed you." The words should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like oil on her skin, slick and wrong. "He couldn't tell me. The will forbade it." "So, he chose money over honesty. That tells you who he is, too." Dylan kissed her forehead. "Stop beating yourself up. You're with me now, and we're going to build something amazing together. Unless you're having second thoughts." The question contained a threat. Anika heard it clearly. Choose now. Commit now. Stop looking backward or lose what you have forward. "No second thoughts," she lied. Dylan's smile returned, warm and charming. "Good. Now, help me figure out who to invite to this dinner party." Over the next few weeks, Dylan returned to the subject of Graham with increasing frequency. Always casually, always framed as curiosity rather than strategy. What was Graham like in personal conversation? How did he handle conflict? What were his blind spots? Anika deflected at first, then started giving vague answers to avoid the tension that built when she refused to engage. She told herself she wasn't really betraying anything, just sharing observations, just making conversation. Then Dylan suggested the article, a think piece about the challenges young executives faced taking over family businesses. A friend of his ran a business news blog that was influential in Arizona development circles. It would be good for you to establish yourself as a voice in this space, Dylan said. Show you're more than just a nonprofit coordinator. Anika wrote the first draft carefully, keeping it general and theoretical. Dylan read it and suggested she use specific examples. Make it concrete. Give readers something they could connect to. You don't have to name names, he said. But using Graham's situation as a case study would make it much more compelling. She resisted. Then Dylan pointed out how often Graham's name appeared in the news, how public his position was. You're not revealing anything private. You're analyzing public information through the lens of someone who understands the human cost of these dynastic transitions. The logic seemed sound. The rationalization seemed reasonable. Anika rewrote the piece with Graham's story woven through it, still not naming him but making it obvious to anyone who knew the context. Dylan loved it. His editor friend loved it. They published it on a Tuesday with a headline that made Anika's stomach turn. The hidden price of inherited power when family fortunes demand personal sacrifice. The piece went viral within the Arizona business community. Not huge, but significant enough. People shared it, commented on it. Some praised her insight. Others criticized her for airing what felt like personal grievances disguised as analysis. Anika saw screenshots appearing on social media with Graham's photo attached. She saw think pieces responding to her think piece. She'd wanted to establish herself as a serious voice. Instead, she'd become known as Graham Mercer's bitter ex-wife. Graham's response came through his legal team. A cease and desist letter, delivered to Dylan's address since that's where Anika now effectively lived. The letter was professional and devastating. It outlined how the article contained misrepresentations, how certain details could only have come from private marital conversations, how the publication had caused reputational harm to Graham personally and to the Mercer Trust professionally. It demanded a retraction and public apology within 72 hours. Anika panicked. Dylan was furious, but not at the legal threat. At her. You told me you were being general, he said coldly. You told me you weren't revealing anything private. I thought I was just analyzing public information, like you said. Well, clearly his lawyers disagree. This is bad, Anika. This makes me look bad by association. He paced his living room, phone already out. I need to distance myself from this? Publicly. What does that mean? It means I can't be connected to this mess. It means you need to handle this on your own. He was already typing a message to someone. I'll have my lawyer reach out to his lawyer and make it clear I had nothing to do with the content of your piece. That you acted independently. But you encouraged me to write it. You connected me with the editor. Dylan looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. I connected you with an opportunity. What you chose to do with that opportunity was your decision. His phone buzzed and he glanced at it. I need to make some calls. Maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight while this gets sorted out. Anika stared at him, understanding clicking into place with sickening clarity. This was who Dylan had always been. She'd just been too desperate to see it. He wasn't a partner. He was an opportunist who'd seen a use for her. And now that she'd become a liability, was cutting his losses with surgical precision. She packed a bag while he made his calls. He didn't try to stop her, didn't apologize or offer support. Just let her leave the same way Graham had let her leave, except Graham's version had contained love and pain, while Dylan's contained only relief at a problem solving itself. Anika checked into a hotel she couldn't afford and tried to figure out her next move. The cease and desist gave her 72 hours. She could retract and apologize, publicly humiliate herself, but maybe avoid legal consequences. Or she could fight, get a lawyer, try to argue that everything she'd written was protected speech or public information. She called 3 attorneys. 2 wouldn't take the case. The third explained gently that she didn't have much of a defense if private marital details had informed the piece, which they clearly had. On hour 68, Dylan called. "I have a solution," he said without preamble. "My lawyer talked to some people. There's a way to flip this." "What way?" "Graham lied to you for 4 years. He hid his real identity, his real wealth. That's fraud. Maybe even financial abuse depending on how we frame it. You write a second piece, a personal essay, explaining how he manipulated you, how he let you suffer financially while sitting on a fortune. We go on offense." Anika's hotel room felt too small suddenly. That's not what happened. It's a version of what happened. Your version. You're entitled to your truth. Dylan, he was following his grandfather's will. He didn't have a choice. He chose not to trust you. He chose to let you leave rather than fight for you. He chose his money over his marriage. Those are facts, Anika. We're just framing them in a way that protects you. This is insane. This is strategy. This is how you survive when someone with more power and resources comes after you. You make them the villain before they make you the victim. His voice softened, became almost gentle. "Look, I know you loved him. I know you feel guilty. But he's coming for you legally. He's going to destroy you financially and reputation-wise unless you fight back. I'm offering you a weapon. Use it." Anika closed her eyes. She thought about Graham's face at the gala, the way he'd looked at her with such finality, the life she'd thrown away and could never get back. Maybe Dylan was right. Maybe she deserved to tell her side. Maybe Graham's pain wasn't the only pain that mattered. "Okay," she whispered. "What do I need to do?" The second article published 23 hours later, a first-person essay titled "The Man I Thought I Married: Living with Financial Deception." It was brutal and intimate and detailed. Anika described the tight budget while Graham had access to millions. The emotional manipulation of letting her believe they were struggling together. The betrayal of discovering the truth only after she'd already left. Dylan's lawyer had helped with the framing, careful to stay just inside the bounds of opinion and personal experience while implying misconduct. The response was immediate and explosive. Social media fractured into camps. Some people saw Anika as a victim finally telling her truth. Others saw her as a bitter ex, trying to destroy a good man. The story got picked up by larger outlets. Anika's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Interview requests, think pieces citing her piece, strangers offering support or condemnation. Graham's response came 48 hours later in the form of a press conference. He stood at a podium with his legal team flanking him, calm and collected and devastating. He presented evidence methodically, text messages between Anika and Dylan showing the coordination of both articles, financial records proving Graham had lived within the will's constraints, including bank statements showing his limited access to family funds during the 3-year period. Most damaging, a recording from Dylan's phone, accidentally backed up to a shared cloud, where Dylan could be heard coaching Anika on how to frame the narrative and make him the villain. "I don't take joy in this," Graham said, his voice steady. "But I won't allow lies to stand unchallenged. Ms. Shaw and I had a marriage that ended. That's painful but private. What's happened since has been a coordinated attempt to damage my reputation and the work of the Mercer Trust. The evidence speaks for itself." He took no questions, just presented the facts and walked away. Dylan's name was now attached to the scandal. By that evening, he'd released a statement claiming he'd been manipulated by Anika, that he'd tried to help her process her emotions, but she'd taken his kindness and twisted it into something unethical. He provided screenshots of messages carefully edited to remove his most damning suggestions, making it look like Anika had been the driving force behind everything. She was alone, completely alone. Dylan had turned on her, Graham had exposed her, the internet had her name and her mistakes laid out for everyone to dissect. She couldn't go back to her apartment in Crescent City. Reporters had found the address. She couldn't stay in the hotel. Her credit card was maxed. She called her father. Suresh came to get her without questions or judgment. He drove her back to Coyote Ridge in silence, and Anika cried the whole way. When they got to the small house she'd grown up in, her mother had tea waiting. They didn't ask her to explain. They just held her while she fell apart. The legal proceedings took 6 months. Graham's team was efficient and professional. They sued for defamation and won. The judgment included financial damages Anika couldn't begin to pay, and a permanent retraction of both articles with a public apology. Her lawyer, the one who'd finally agreed to represent her, negotiated probation instead of jail time for the fraud-adjacent aspects of the coordinated smear campaign. Dylan settled separately, paying a larger sum and agreeing to certain business restrictions. He managed to keep his name mostly out of the final headlines. Anika became the face of the scandal. She lost her job at the nonprofit, lost her apartment, lost any credibility in the professional circles she'd been trying to break into. Her name on a Google search returned pages of articles about the case. She was unemployable in Crescent City, probably unemployable in any major Arizona city. Her father suggested she consider a fresh start somewhere smaller. Redfield was a town of 7,800 people, 3 hours from Crescent City, small enough that nobody knew her story or cared about Phoenix Metro drama. A friend of Suresh's owned a bookstore and needed help. The pay was minimum wage. The work was shelving and inventory and ringing up purchases. It was the opposite of everything Anika had wanted for herself. She took the job. The first year in Redfield passed in a blur of quiet shame and slowly rebuilding. Anika lived in a studio apartment above a hardware store. She worked 6 days a week at the bookstore. She didn't make friends, didn't date, didn't engage with social media, just existed in the smallest life possible, the very thing she'd fought so hard to avoid. Gradually, something shifted. The bookstore owner, Mrs. Chen, was kind without being intrusive. The regular customers started to recognize Anika, greet her by name. The work was simple but not meaningless. She helped people find stories, recommended books, created small moments of connection over shared loves of certain authors or genres. One afternoon, 18 months into her Redfield exile, a customer mentioned seeing something about the Mercer Trust in the news. Anika's hands froze on the book she was wrapping. "Oh," she managed. "Yeah, the CEO just got married. Some big charity wedding, donated all the gifts to their foundation instead of keeping them. Seems like a good guy." Anika finished wrapping the book with careful precision. "That's nice." His wife runs some kind of international education nonprofit, Harper something. They seem really well matched. That night, Anika allowed herself to Google it. Just once. Just to see. The photos from Graham and Harper Lane's wedding were beautiful, tasteful. Harper was gorgeous and accomplished, a director at a philanthropic organization doing global work. She and Graham looked at each other in the photos, the way people in love look at each other. Real love. Partnership love. Anika studied Harper's face and saw everything she herself had never been. Secure enough not to need constant validation. Accomplished enough not to measure herself against others. Substantive enough to be Graham's actual equal. She closed the laptop and cried, not because she wanted Graham back, but because she finally understood what she'd lost. Not a rich husband, a good man, a real partner. Someone who'd loved her despite her flaws and insecurities, and had been willing to build something meaningful in the small space they'd had together. The second year in Redfield brought something unexpected. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. Anika stopped waiting for her real life to start somewhere else. Stopped measuring her days against some fantasy of what success looked like. She planted herbs in pots on her windowsill, joined a book club, started taking community college classes online, studying for pleasure rather than advancement. Mrs. Chen promoted her to assistant manager. The raise was modest but felt earned in a way nothing in her previous life had felt earned. Anika learned the business, built relationships with publishers' reps, organized author events for local writers. The work was ordinary, she was ordinary, and slowly, painfully, she learned to be okay with that. On a Tuesday afternoon, in her third year in Redfield, a young woman came into the bookstore looking frustrated. "I'm supposed to be happy," she told Anika while browsing self-help titles. "I have a good job, a nice boyfriend, but I just feel like I'm supposed to want more. Like if I'm not constantly climbing towards something bigger, I'm wasting my life." Anika looked at this girl who could have been her younger self and felt something crack open in her chest. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "The thing you're climbing toward, it's not actually there. Or it is, but when you reach it, you'll just see another mountain and feel the same emptiness. The wanting never stops unless you stop it yourself." The young woman looked at her with surprise. "That's kind of depressing." "Maybe. Or maybe it's freeing. Maybe it means you get to choose what enough looks like, instead of letting everyone else choose for you." The girl bought a novel instead of self-help and left looking thoughtful. Mrs. Chen, who'd overheard, smiled at Anika. "Good advice. Learned it the hard way. That's the only way any of us learn anything that matters." Anika closed the bookstore that night and walked home through Redfield's quiet streets. The town wasn't glamorous, her apartment wasn't impressive. Her life wouldn't generate any social media envy, but it was hers. Built on truth this time instead of performance. Built on small choices instead of grand schemes. She thought about Graham sometimes, hoped he was happy, hoped Harper appreciated what she had in a way Anika never had. Mostly, though, she thought about the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. The journey between those two versions had cost her everything. But maybe everything she'd lost had been the wrong. Everything all along. If you made it this far in the story, thank you for watching. Anika's journey shows us how chasing the wrong dreams can cost us the right reality. If this story made you think differently about ambition, love, or what we value in life, hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Anika's situation. Would you have stayed with Graham? Would you have made different choices? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And please subscribe to this channel for more stories that make us question our assumptions about success and happiness. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.